Guten Abend. Ich freue mich, dass wir doch so viele sind. This evening is going to be in English language, so I'll say the same thing in English. Good evening to all of you. Good evening to the people on the podium. Irene Horejs, who will be moderating this evening. Jan Pospisil, who is not new to us, certainly after his Sudan book. Thomas Vieregge, he changes sides. Normally he's asking questions, now it's the other way around. And I'm greeting also the Chief of Cabinet of Annette Weber and Madame Kholood from Sudan. Very quickly, we are, this is now a commonplace to say, in a deep change of world order. Africa, European Union, there was a high point in relations after the summit in Cairo in 2000, the summit 2007 in Lisbon, a common strategy, and everybody was looking towards a brilliant common future. 7 years later, I think it was the summit number 4, there was the first disappointment. Things didn't work out as they should have, and another 7 or 8 years later, in 2022, you could already talk about an estrangement. The last summit was classified as, yes, quite satisfactory of the European Union. The African Union told us, listen, you are not the only partner. If you don't like it, you don't have to. We have many others. This was a sort of beginning of a degradation of world order. But this was just the beginning. A few years later, we have to talk about a total breakdown of our world order, and Africa is not untouched by that. And if you look from outside, and we have been all in positive phases when we look to Africa as the youngest continent of so many young people who were wishing to conquer their own life in their countries, but conquer the world. And what happens, the old colonial ghosts, I would say, are still haunting us, haunting them and us. We see today an ongoing war in Khartoum, in Congo. Rwanda has troops in the Congo, as has Uganda. Something similar is happening in the Sahel zone, and it is not different in the Sahel, in the Horn of Africa, about which you will be talking today. There is a large war going on now in Sudan. South Sudan is almost at this point. So this is why the title of this evening has a question mark afterwards, implications for Europe. I think it's going to be a very interesting evening. What we now have to do is, in fact, ourselves, the Europeans and the Austrians, to re-look at everything. And we have to learn that the world has become not only more disorderly, but much more complex to comprehend. With this, I wish us all an interesting evening. Thank you.
So thank you very much for these welcome words. Thank you very much to all of you for coming and for attending this event today. So I'm very pleased that we have been able to bring together a very interesting panel, which I just will present. So first of all, and let's start with the ladies first, even if they are online. So the ladies, we have Kholood Khair. So I hope that I pronounced well your name, Kholood. So she's the founder and director of Confluence Advisory, which is a think and do tank in Khartoum, and which works for peace and security, economy and governance. So Kholood is also part of the Yale Peace Fellows working on inclusive peace. So she's a researcher, political analyst on Sudan and on the Horn of Africa, and has written several pieces in international publications. And she has briefed the UN Security Council twice. She has also briefed the US Congress and UK parliamentarians. So Kholood has a Master of Science in Violent Conflict and Development from the Institute of Oriental and African Studies of the University of London, and an MSc in African Studies from the University of Oxford. Thank you very much for accepting to join us, even if it's online. So we very much hope next time it will be in person. So then to the next lady, Pavla, Danisova. She's a European diplomat and presently serving as the head of cabinet of the EU Special Representative for the Horn of Africa, Annette Weber. So she has worked previously in the European Action Service, in the European External Action Service, in conflict prevention, mediation support, in particular on the Horn of Africa. So very focused and very specialized also on the region of the Horn. So then we have Dr. Jan Pospisil. Thank you very much for coming. So he is Austrian, but he came from the UK now. Is associate professor at the Center for Peace and Security at Coventry University, and co-investigator in the Peace and Conflict Resolution Evidence Platform, University of Edinburgh. Previously, he was director of research at the Austrian Center for Peace in Stadtleining and at the Austrian Institute for International Politics. So, and finally, last but not least, Mr. Thomas Vieregge. He is an Austrian journalist, specialized in foreign policy and working since '98 for Die Presse. For several years, he was both in Berlin and in Washington, and currently working predominantly on Middle East and the US. So thank you, all of you, for coming. So on the topic, why we have organized several events on the Horn now since last year. We had Annette Weber here, so on the region, on the conflicts in the region, and also a little bit similar on the geopolitics of the region. Then we had in November a very special event on Sudan, on the war in Sudan, together also with political analysts and people of the Sudanese diaspora. We are talking about the region because it's of extremely, a very important region also for Europe. And it's a region, a theater of, is a region with very large multi-ethnic countries, Ethiopia, Eritrea, Somalia, Sudan, South Sudan. So we will bring the map in afterwards, please. And the only tiny country there is Djibouti. It's a region in permanent turmoil, and we are now in the middle also of a global turmoil. So we have a region with a lot of political upheavals and conflicts. So the region is a theater of a number of very bloody conflicts, which have produced some of the largest humanitarian crises today. So today, Sudan, the war in Tigray, of course, but now Sudan is the largest humanitarian crisis with 13, 14 million of people displaced, and half of the population, which is more than 15 million, in desperate need of humanitarian aid. And all these quite largely absent from the media lens in our country, at least. So despite being very important for Europe and for another large number of international powers. So the geopolitical interest is also, so it's also a region that attracts a lot of powers. And we will see that the Red Sea, Djibouti is very crowded of powers competing for influence, for security, to be the security providers. So it comes, first of all, because it is the Horn of Africa is the opposite of the Arabian Peninsula and on the Red Sea. And the Red Sea is the main maritime route for global trade. About 15% of global maritime trade goes through the Red Sea. A substantial part of European imports on liquid gas go through that. Last year, there was damage to undersea cables, 14 undersea cables, and 25% of the data traffic between Europe and Asia broke down. So we see that and the recent attacks by the Houthis, they have forced a number of commercial ships reroute because they cannot reroute, not going through the Suez Canal, but taking a 10 days longer route around the Cape, around Africa, to come to Europe. So international powers focused mostly on maritime security. So we have a crowd of military bases along the coast of the Horn of Africa. And only this tiny state of Djibouti hosts military bases of China, of France, of Japan, of Italy, and the United States. Turkey, the United Emirates, and the UK have their bases in Somalia, which is quite next to it. Could you put the map into, please? We have, in Somalia, Russia and Iran are seeking to establish their bases in Port Sudan. So we have really a crowd of powers, one along the other one. So, and the Horn is also a hotbed for security interest. So not only for the Red Sea, but also for being a transit route between south and north towards Egypt, and between the Red Sea and the Sahel. So it's a very important transit route for every kind of, for all kind of goods. So we are talking about the region which attracts geopolitical interests and which is a theater of a lot of conflicts. So where we have where the external powers fuel the local conflicts and vice versa. So, and I'm very happy to have really the expert here. So Jan Pospisil, I would ask you to walk us a little bit through the region and to explain perhaps so the different conflict theaters, what happens, which are the drivers, who are the main players in in these different conflicts. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. Should I stay here or should I go there? I think I can even talk from here.
You can do however you want.
You see the map better perhaps from here. Thanks so much for inviting me, first of all, and also thanks for giving the overview why the Horn is actually such an important region. We've heard like it's an important trade route. It's almost 30% of the container traffic, the global container traffic, going through the Horn to the sea, to Europe. But you have to take into account it's not just the container ships, which are now hardly hit by the recent attacks by the Houthis. It's also like militarily super important, as you said, by all the bases that are around. So the geostrategic importance of the region is just immense, and especially now with the turmoil in the region increasing, especially over the last 5 years, there's also the fear that like this instability might spill over and might become like a broader issue that even extends regional borders. We have also to take into account, and this is probably the third factor why the region is of such importance, There's also considerable resources that go through. We have several oil routes going. There is pipelines planned. At the moment, there's one pipeline going to Port Sudan, but there's pipeline routes planned to Dar es Salaam that go from Uganda probably through, which is a bit south of the region, but still like has implications of oil that is produced. We have considerable gold resources that go through the Arab Peninsula, partly also through Turkey. So you see that there is resource routes going through the region, like through the broader region, that are of significant importance. So this is basically why we're looking at that, and why this region is of importance beyond just the immediate realm. What we see, and this is what I've said over the last 5-6 years, there is an increasing instability. The region was never really stable. This would be perhaps an overstatement, but still, like Ethiopia had like before Abiy took over as a prime minister, like at least like a fairly stable balance of power. You had like a long-standing dictatorship in Sudan that guaranteed not like a good situation in Sudan, because there was wars in most parts of the country, but at least like it was for external powers something to count on, something to calculate, which is now falling apart. Why this happened? So why these events unfolded over the last years? And this is the main argument I want to make. It's in a way a twofold element. Some of this coincidental, some of this is just accidental that it came together. I would argue that on the one hand, a shift to a post-liberal order that comes and coincides with a shift of interest by the US, which started basically from the Obama administration to refocus their like mainstay of foreign policy from at least like the Arab Peninsula, from this broader region around here to the Pacific. This is not something that came with Trump. This is really coming from far before, and this enabled a lot of other regional actors to come in. This enabled also, and this is the argument with the internal things that happened, quite a lot of, it gave a space to actors in the region, at the national level, even at the subnational level, to act in a way that they couldn't probably do before. So it's these two elements coming together, I would argue, that in a way cause or at least enable what we're seeing today. Just to go through some of the countries, some of the main countries we're seeing, just to explain what is actually happening here. I think Sudan is probably, as we've heard, the biggest humanitarian crisis at the moment globally. And it started actually as a very positive thing in 2019 when the long dictatorship of Omar Bashir was toppled by a public uprising, which was then supported by, at one point, by the Sudanese armed forces as well. And it happened then that there was a complex discussion around like transiting to civilian rule, perhaps elections at the end point. But we have seen then that not the least through considerable influence by other actors in the region, that this whole transition process went wrong. And I mean, like I've already mentioned it now, I come to the actors later. It's no surprise that the biggest international actor active in Sudan are the United Arab Emirates. They have clear interests, not just in Sudan, we come to that in a second, but in other parts of the region. And it appears that it's not a proxy war. It would be really wrong to see Sudan as a proxy war, but the international impact in how this war unfolded is significant. We have, and this is in a way interesting, that it comes almost at the same time, and it was then at one point even intertwined when you look at Eritrea. Severe changes to the political system in Ethiopia, which came with the takeover of the new prime minister, Abiy Ahmed. He decided, and this is also something which for long wasn't that kind of thinkable, to undo the long-standing system in Ethiopia of ethnic federalism. So a fragile kind of framework of regions that are mainly ethnically defined, with where everybody had kind of a buy-in, but was overall, and this was what Abiy mainly wanted to attack, with a strong influence of Tigray and what was before the TPLF in the center of Ethiopia. And him undoing this system, and he was very clear, he wanted to undo the system, form a more centralized Ethiopia, and this was then the kickoff for a war that I think in the dimensions still that happened is not that clear to many. We have numbers confirmed by the United Nations that the Tigray war killed about 500,000 people in Tigray alone, which is probably unprecedented in such a short time period. And what Ethiopia did is something which I think wouldn't have been possible in years before, where there was strong international pressure, because what Ethiopia was doing was shutting off the region completely from any international aid, any international observation. There was literally nothing going in there, and they were together with the Eritrean army basically trying to wipe out the Tigrayan population in the area. This is something which is a new dimension that had been introduced in I think, atrocities in the region, really, that came through this. Interestingly, Ethiopia has still, with Abiy, not just the plan of undoing the previous system of governance, but also, and this comes to the main argument I wanted to do in the beginning, it has the interest to become a regional power, a clear regional power. And what they are saying, and this is even like people from the foreign ministry telling me, in order to become a regional power, we need a navy. There's no point for us becoming a regional power when we can't project our military power to the Red Sea. They have just a little problem that they have no sea access, which is a trigger point for a lot of conflicts. Since we don't go too deep into national issues, just to mention that, of course, then as a logical step, they tried to find ports. They are not happy with Djibouti because Djibouti is too crowded, so coming in as the 7th or 8th kind of international actor to Djibouti is not what they are fond of, so they tried to explore, could there be an option in Eritrea? But with the increasing tensions again, so the friendship between Ethiopia and Eritrea fell apart rather quickly. So these ports in Eritrea wouldn't be an option. So then they started negotiating in Somaliland, almost coming to a memorandum of understanding that Ethiopia would offer Somaliland international recognition as a nation state in exchange for using their port for their navy, which led to a huge regional fallout with Somalia and then international actors coming in and disputing that. So at the moment this is stalled in a way, but this issue is still there, and we cannot be assured that Ethiopia is not stepping down from the plan to install a navy and get sea access. So we have other issues. Somalia, and we must not forget that it has taken a bit of a backstep. There is a new big African Union mission coming into the country, which is currently negotiated. At the moment, there is, it seems, a bit an international agreement that we believe this government, which is a kind of a new government, new president in place for now a bit more than a year, as I remember. But this is a bit of a chimera. This country is most of the territory controlled still by Al-Shabaab. This government is not really in control of anything, and just because at the moment everybody's kind of quiet, this does not mean that Somalia is kind of stabilized and under any kind of unified control. What is important for Somalia to see that it is and has always been, and we heard this before, a strong ally of Turkey and Turkish interests in the region, which are considerably increasing, is mainly projected from Somalia. They use the port there, but we must not forget that Turkey has also started to invest a bit in Ethiopia, and that they are now mainly also engaged in the Sudanese war, opposing the UAE with siding with the Sudanese army. So they gave, just as an example, their famous Bayraktar drones to the Sudanese army in recent weeks and months without even getting immediate payment for it. So they gave it to them for future considerations, whatever these future considerations are. Some of our guests might know more, but it is interesting that as such this happens. So you see already with these things that there is like a regional power play going on in all these actual nationalized conflicts that are very specific, but you have the same actors coming in at all sorts of places. Without going into more detail in the countries, just let me have a quick look at these international actors and regional powers that try to have like a grip on the region. And I think number one to mention here are indeed the United Arab Emirates. They have bought a lot of land in Ethiopia. They have like investments in Somalia, South Sudan, and they are basically behind one of the parties in the Sudanese war at the moment. They're very close with the Rapid Support Forces. I've heard reports that basically the Rapid Support Force intelligence wing is based in Abu Dhabi even. They get their weapons from there. They get like quite a huge financial supplies from there. And the UAE have also like a considerable interest in Kenya. The big question behind that is, and this is really challenging to answer, what do they actually want? Because nobody has a real clear idea about that, and they're also not clear in communicating that. In general, they would they try to downplay on diplomatic level that they're actually involved so much. They would say their interest is not so big, and even if then they get pushed, they would not necessarily make clear what their interest is. I think what we see empirically, that the UAE are incredibly interested in fertile land, because this is what they're buying. This is also what they're trying to get in Sudan out of the Sudan war. So there might be an idea behind that this fertile land would give, and this is my interpretation of this, would give a solid base for agriculture and for also something like food independence, which is of course very difficult to achieve in a country like UAE. This is basically a desert. So there might be broader interests behind this, what is happening here, and really long-term strategic thinking that might go in other temporalities even as we think here in Europe or even the US. We have heard about Turkey, we have heard about Egypt, so this is powers not too far apart. They would side usually with parties opposing the UAE. So there is a regional game going on which pitches to an extent Turkey and Egypt against the UAE, although these things are often more flexible than they look like, because there is also commercial operations going on. There might be interests that fall together at one point. So it's not that, like, it's not like a Cold War scenario by any means. But in general, you will see that there is an alignment going on of regional actors going against one another. And then we have still like the old big powers there. China is in the region quite considerably. I would argue more in terms of economic interests, so following their own economic interests. They had not been so prominently engaged in political endeavors. They have not been so much engaged in peace processes. They have not sided so clearly in any kinds of the ongoing conflicts. Their interest is really a return of investing productively and earning money in the region, I would argue. It's a bit different for Russia, which is also there, and for them the whole kind of battlefield of especially like the whole Central African belt has become more and more important, even with the war in the Ukraine and their invasion of the Ukraine going on. They had like loads of debates of getting a port in Sudan. They had trying to take over the gold operations from what was the Wagner Group before, which wasn't straightforward and don't have the control so much. But they are still, even after the end of the Wagner Group, considerable investment and military projection going from the Sahel over to basically Sudan. So they are around, they are there, and they are like really sketched out there in most of the areas in the region. The big issue is where does this leave the others, like US, Europe, the UK. I think the UK does some diplomatic efforts at the moment. The US tried under the last administration especially to get a Sudanese peace process going. They failed spectacularly, I would say. And since the Trump administration took over, the only thing we hear in terms of their regional interest is that they want to bring Palestinians from Gaza now to Sudan, because they think obviously this is an empty space and open for like people to come. There is at the moment nobody in charge for the region in the State Department, as I hear. There's a placeholder. So there's no clear US policy, and even if there are some entities doing things, this can change tomorrow. So at the moment, this actor is almost a bit neutralized in this. And Europe is, I would think, in a rather weak position, also through like a long kind of disengagement. There was, I think, quite a lot of efforts, we hear later from Annette Weber's team, to stay engaged, to do a productive, make a productive intervention, especially when it comes to peace processes. Ethiopia has been one major focus here, because like an Ethiopia falling apart is a nightmare scenario, basically, for all sorts of actors. So there is a clear interest in making this a priority, but I think it's a very, very difficult element. Just to come back to the beginning, what we see here, and I think I tried to show this in what I said, that there is a linkage between very particular processes at the national level, also the subnational level. It didn't even touch South Sudan, which is super difficult in its own right, and an alignment of these kind of national, subnational conflicts with regional configurations that are also highly conflictive. And this is in a way, I think, enabled by a new vacuum, by the end of an international liberal order on the one hand, but also this international liberal order underpinned by clear power interests that in a way stabilize this region for some time, but these days are, I would think, over.
Thank you very much. I think you did a very comprehensive overview, including already about the geopolitical, the different geopolitical actors. So I would like to give the floor now to somebody from the region. Kholood, I wanted to ask you, let's go a little bit down. So we have been on the geopolitical level. So let's come down a little bit to what is happening actually in the region and for people in the region. Could you please you're coming from Sudan, from the main conflict that everybody fears, which is the priority of everybody, but you have also been looking at Ethiopia, Somalia, South Sudan. Can you just give us your perspective on the different conflict and on the question to what extent also these conflicts, are they a product of outside influence, of their resources, or what triggered the conflicts there? So what are the main drivers there?
Thank you. I think it's as Jan said, it's a combination of issues. You have, all these countries in the region that had at least a stable form of internal competitions that arose out of the fact that none of these states are really sort of well-defined states. They're either new states like Eritrea, Somaliland, if we can call it a state, and South Sudan, all reasonably new, but even the older states, Ethiopia, Sudan, Somalia, that have seen this disintegration take place, these are countries where the disintegration has taken place because the state project was never completed. And even for countries like Ethiopia that never really underwent any kind of colonial rule, the colonial, actions and activities that were happening around them in the region. You had Italians, you had French, you had the Brits, you had a whole host of countries vying for power there. That really sort of stirred up a lot of internal disputes between different groups that were never really resolved in the independence era. Sudan, for example, has never really had a fully fledged national project. This is where we get South Sudan coming out of this. In terms of Ethiopia and Eritrea, the elites in the north could never really sort of get together and see eye to eye. They could not agree, along with other people in the country, across the country, on whether they would have a fully federalized system or a centralized system or something in between. And that, tussle between the two different viewpoints is still ongoing. South Sudan has never really been able to have the opportunity, I think, to allow for a different set of elites to emerge. And so what you have in South Sudan is this sclerotic tier of politicians that have been around, really since before secession, and who have been jostling for power and also for control of the economy for decades now. And they've, to some degree, been evenly matched or been able to get the kinds of elite bargains between different groups to keep them in power, to keep them at play. And now we see a major change in that. We see the Khair regime really consolidating, and that's caused a lot of instability. In Somalia, the deterioration that we saw after Siad Barre was, kicked out of power in 1991 has never really coalesced into a state. There have been several attempts, several peace agreements, but even as we speak, Al-Shabaab, the jihadi group in Somalia, is surrounding Mogadishu and could potentially enter the city, fully. In a matter of weeks. And so what you have here is, the central power in all of the countries I've mentioned here, with the exception of Eritrea, ironically, really have power contested, and Djibouti as well, really have power contested by a strong, major, strong ethnic armed group, or an ideologically based armed group that is able to push back against the central rule. And that's because all of these countries, to some degree or other, have some kind of militarized rule, which means really the only way that you can contest the state is through arms. Now, obviously, Djibouti is slightly different. Somaliland is slightly different. It's had several rounds of successful democratic elections. Eritrea is different because it's a one-man, one-party rule, and he has had a firm grip on Eritrea, but that seems to be about to change. There are a lot of tensions within the country, and if Eritrea and Ethiopia go to war, which all signs are indicating that they very much might, that will change things. Similarly, for the longevity of SAS Afwerki's rule. And so what we have here is a state, a series of states all surrounding each other in a state of flux. And usually when you have this, you have those who mean to make the most of it, those who mean to exploit it. And at the same time, you have Gulf countries that are trying to consolidate their own influence over the region. And they have seen that this region, which is rich in resources, close to waterways, both the Nile and the Red Sea, not just the Red Sea, but the Nile too, which is super important for both Egypt and Ethiopia and Sudan, as well as other littoral states like South Sudan and Uganda. And it's these, sort of middle powers, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Israel, who are all Western allies, who now see an opportunity to really jostle for power and influence here. And so what you have is, several anxieties at the sort of regional level that are playing a part in the ways in which these states are experiencing conflict. I agree with Jan. A lot of these issues, I don't think we can label as proxy issues. I think that takes the agency and the focus away from national level and local level actors who have a lot of influence here. But I think we cannot also, fail to see the very deep anxieties that exist in the region within these middle powers that are forcing some of these conflicts to break out in the way that they have. And in the case of, for example, Sudan, we're seeing that it is these middle powers that are keeping the war going. And so now it's no longer the case of just seeing, how to get Sudanese actors to within the country to be able to, work together towards a peace deal. You also have to make sure the interests of countries in the region are also aligned. And that's several layers of a political interest that we need that didn't exist before. In 2005, when the 22-year civil war in Sudan between the government in Sudan and a rebel group in the south, when that peace deal was being inked, the major players were all Western players and perhaps Russia and China. But now you have many more players whose interests also have to be met. And none of these actors, particularly those who play a major role in the Horn, particularly the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Turks, the Iranians, the Qataris, the West to some degree, but mostly these actors in the region, none of them are really interested in seeing sort of a popular-led democratic vision in these countries. They much prefer this idea of strongman rule, but also military rule, which makes it easier to broker deals. It makes it easier to, sort of predict what this country looks like in terms of whichever country you're thinking of here, what it looks like for the foreseeable future. They don't like the idea of change. They already have to deal with democratic changes in places like Europe and the United States every 4 to 8 years, where they're dealing with a different set of interlocutors. They don't want to have to do that in their backyards.
Okay. I want to stop you here. Thank you very much. I think it was very comprehensive by both of you. So what we have actually is, or what you're saying is, that we have in every country or in every conflict areas, a conflict which arises basically by local ambitions or has local drivers, but then in a very transactional way is also fueled by outsiders or outside powers. And mostly, as you have said both, it is either for interests to control certain routes, for access to gold, to oil, to resources, and none of these outside powers that you have mentioned, the Emirates in first instance, Turkey, and so a lot of newcomers that we are not used to mention. When we mention geopolitics, then we always think about Russia, China, the US, and now we have a set of players that are coming here and that are playing a very powerful play and who prefer to have military rulers in place because it's easier with them to make a deal. Did I interpret you rightly? No.
Yes, I was just going to end by saying, in none of these considerations are the wishes of locals,
of the people,
civilians ever being represented.
Okay, thank you very much. So I will come now, give the floor to Pavla. Pavla, we have been, Jan has mentioned before that he is looking at the Western powers failing or Europe in a weak position there. So, and you are head of cabinet of the special envoy of the EU for the Horn of Africa. Can you explain us a little bit? One, how does the EU analyze the risk and the interests it has in this? What are the stakes of the EU? What are we playing in the Horn of Africa? And second, what is the strategy? What's the instrument? How is the EU working there? Please.
It is a real pleasure to be with you tonight, at least remotely, and greeting from Brussels. I think a lot has been said. We really have multiple crises hitting the region at once against this backdrop of uncertainties surrounding the new US administration. And if you look, yes.
I think we have lost your image. It's only the beamer. Okay, now you are there. Yeah,
very good. Yeah. I think if you look at the region overall, we have a huge regional conflict in Sudan that now risks to spill over into neighboring countries, putting a lot of pressure and being a factor of instability in both Chad and South Sudan. We have tensions between Ethiopia and Eritrea that was also very much mentioned. This is partly linked to Sudan, as Eritrea clearly stands in support of SAF, but most importantly linked to the access to the sea for Ethiopia. Then we have Somalia with the political disagreements between the federal government and the federal member states, which is very well used by Al-Shabaab in their territorial advance. And all this in the context of uncertainty about the new AUSOM mission and its funding. And then if you go up to the Red Sea, we have the Houthis threatening the maritime shipping and the proliferation of trafficking and collaboration between the Houthis, Al-Shabaab, Daesh, and the Pirate groups, not necessarily for ideological reasons, but mainly for convenience and profit. Now, how does this affect the EU's interests, and what is the EU doing about that? For the EU, the stability in the region is absolutely essential. What we want to avoid is increased migratory pressures on Europe. We also aim to prevent proliferation of violent extremism. If you look at Al-Shabaab or Daesh or the Houthis, this is of clear concern. We also aim to avoid increasing Russian and Iranian influence, which would bring more instability to the region. And yes, the Red Sea is geostrategically located because of the European trade with Asia. More than 20% of all international trade was passing through the Bab el-Mandeb before the Houthi attacks started. And you also mentioned the subsea cables that go through the Red Sea and that connect Europe and Asia in terms of communication. So what can the EU do? In Sudan, first, we feel that we need to keep political attention on the conflict so that it really doesn't become a forgotten crisis. We now have the 2nd anniversary of the outbreak of the conflict coming up with the London Ministerial Conference on Sudan. We will also have the EU Ministers of Foreign Affairs in the Council discussing Sudan on Monday. Shuttle diplomacy is very important here. We engage with the warring parties, combining both positive and negative incentives for them to commit to negotiations. We also engage with all the actors in the region. And it is also very important to prepare ground for future negotiations with confidence-building measures, but also by being active on protection of civilians, in addition to the major humanitarian effort and support to resilience of displaced populations. Now, we believe that one important incentive is to engage the parties on issues of common interest, which could work as confidence-building measures and possible stepping stones towards a renewed ceasefire negotiation process. The EU Special Representative for the Horn of Africa, Vieregge, is currently discussing with the warring parties. Yeah.
Slowly, so that we
okay.
Yeah. Okay.
She is currently discussing with the warring parties the initiative for the protection of critical infrastructure, in which both sides of the conflict have expressed strong interest. The initiative focuses in particular on dams and water reservoirs, which are an important factor in the protection of civilian population, whether from flooding or in terms of access to drinking water. Now, the discussions are now on the text of a declaration of commitment for protection of critical infrastructure in Sudan. They are very well advanced, and there are 3 main objectives: to allow for access by technical teams to ensure maintenance of these facilities, to agree on a non-aggression pact on critical infrastructure, and maybe most importantly, to create a platform where the parties could exchange on possible violations of the agreement, but also on issues of common interest. Maybe also important to mention that the declaration has a strong language in terms of international humanitarian law, and also represents a strong political commitment of both warring parties to the principles of the international humanitarian law. So maybe just to conclude on Sudan, there is a lot being done in terms of shuttle diplomacy. The EUSR has also organized a series of meetings among civilian actors in the effort to provide a platform for the various civilian factions to agree on common positions towards ending the conflict. Coming to South Sudan, and maybe I'll develop a little bit more on South Sudan because that was not so much mentioned here. Annette Weber has been in Juba today, and as part of her regional tour, she held meetings in Kenya end of last week. She was in Uganda earlier this week, and she will be in Addis tomorrow. South Sudan is an interesting case because it was very deeply affected by the conflict in Sudan, still is, especially by the rupture of the oil pipeline that crosses the Sudanese territory towards Port Sudan, which had a huge impact on South Sudanese revenues and basically triggered a major economic, political, and humanitarian crisis. And many South Sudanese were also recruited to fight on both sides of the Sudan conflict. The Sudanese armed forces and the rapid support forces have both linkages to various parties and factions in South Sudan. And as the RSF was recently forced to withdraw from Khartoum, they now have an increased interest to control the border region with South Sudan to protect their own supply lines. And therefore, the risk that South Sudan will get drawn into the Sudan conflict is literally increasing every day. And after 70 years of very fragile peace, South Sudan is today at risk of sliding back into a civil war. The armed clashes in Upper Nile between the White Army and the SSPDF, the South Sudan's People's Defense Forces, triggered a series of moves against the opposition, and this obviously puts enormous pressure on the existing peace agreement that has been significantly weakened by the lack of its implementation. Now, the recent house arrest of the first Vice President, Riek Machar, was the latest escalation, obviously in the broader context of the nearing succession to President Khair. Maybe just to finish with Somalia, what the EU can do there. Obviously, we are encouraging political dialogue and reform. together with the Somali authorities, we agreed a couple of years back on a joint operational roadmap. 3 pillars to that joint work. First one and most important one was political reforms. The second one, security transition. And the third one, economic development. Now, the first political pillar is by far the most important because our support to the security transition in Somalia can only be successful if we see political changes and more inclusive dialogue. And from this point of view, the divide that we see today between the federal government and the Somalia's federal member states is highly problematic. So the EU remains again engaged with very strong financial support to the Somali government, but also in the Red Sea. I mean, we have very substantial involvement through the Aspides naval mission, plus a lot of programs and projects in support of maritime security. Yet it is clear that only some form of a broader regional security framework can provide more durable security in the Red Sea. I will leave it at that and very much looking forward to the discussion. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I just want to summarize a bit. So what you say, the EU is very engaged with the different parties. So, and you are trying to make, to offer, for example, in Sudan, some points of dialogue, like rebuild critical infrastructure where the two parties can talk and work together. And that you are also, that another of your priority is now also South Sudan, I understand, and a third one, Somalia. So let me just ask, at the very beginning you mentioned also that the risk that you analyze is the international terrorism, and of course the economic risk in the Red Sea, but also migration. So why do you think that there might be, so for the moment the figures do not indicate an increasing migration pressure which comes from the region. So why do you focalize so much on that, if it's not for the general European narrative?
I would slightly disagree that there is not an increase. We actually, the latest numbers already show a slight increase when it comes to Sudanese arrivals. Obviously, traditionally, the highest numbers are Eritrea and Somalia. But I think here the main concern is also the withdrawal of US aid and the potential that this can have on the humanitarian side. There is indeed a lot of nervousness. No one can fill this gap that such a withdrawal will create. The US was providing around 60% of humanitarian efforts in the various countries of the Horn of Africa. And I think one of the likely implications will be some degree of movements of populations. But maybe just to reply that this is more forward-looking approach and looking at the kind of broader uncertainties in the region. And the withdrawal of the US aid, it's not only withdrawing humanitarian support, it is also a lot of impact on economies of the countries. You may know that it's been a significant part of the GDPs of the countries, and you now have entire economies but also entire sectors such as healthcare or education that can be affected.
Okay, thank you. We will come to the US just in a moment with the others. So maybe, so I just want to go, so thank you very much for the moment. So I have another question then to you, but maybe just to ask, Thomas Vieregge, you are a specialist, you have been observing US politics and you are coming from the Presse, which is a very business-oriented paper also, you're looking on paper. So I have two questions to you. One, so what can we, so one thing is the turmoil in the region and the effects on the tensions in the Red Sea. There is produce an obvious disruption of trade and of maritime shipping. So do you feel, or have you been observing, is this felt at the level of EU business? Is there a tangible feeling at the EU business? And the second question I wanted to ask you is about the US, but I will come then afterwards.
For the first part, I couldn't answer that because I don't feel there's a great disruption in trade now. In that case, the US is doing the job. They are trying to attack and bomb the Houthis and try to make sure that the sea passage is okay. So that's one part there where the US is doing the job. But quite telling was, of course, these chat protocol, which was revealed by the Atlantic by Jeffrey Goldberg, the editor-in-chief. And in it, G.D. Vance was saying, I hate to help out the Europeans because we are not so much concerned about the level of the sea trade to the Red Sea, because maybe we are concerned about 3% of the trade, but Europe is more or less 40%. So I hate to help out the freeloaders, as he called it. Pete Hegseth, the defense minister, was consenting him. So this is what the view in Washington now is versus Europe, and the US is doing the job, as I said, but not with a great enthusiasm. And it is doing the job partly because it is sort of protecting Israel of the rockets coming from the Houthis. And this is the twofold problem here. The engagement of the Trump administration in Africa is, you can't feel that. I mean, you mentioned US aid before. So the cessation of US aid, of course, is troubling and is for Africa, it's a disaster. And thousands, 10,000, 100,000 people will be dying. There are some reports already in. And I think there will be a restructuring of the US aid. They are trying to begin resettle it in some countries already. But I don't know. It's very unpredictable what's going on there. And the other part is, I mean, I remember Trump saying in the first period, he was talking about the shithole countries in Africa. So this is his view, how he perceives, let's say, the global South. In that regard, the administrations of Clinton, of even George W. Bush, not so much Obama, interestingly. He was not that much engaged. And Biden, he was organizing an African summit in Washington, but he didn't follow up because he promised to visit the African countries in the year after, but it was delayed and delayed and delayed. And until his last month, in December or November, he was visiting Angola and trying to get an infrastructure project on the rails. But on the other hand, it was, of course, we talked about that. He was trying to broker a peace deal with the Saudis in Sudan, in Jeddah, and it failed. So they kept their fingers away. And now, Jan Pospisil said it. There is no African strategy in the State Department. There's no one interested in going there. I mean, Marco Rubio is, of course, he is going to America, Middle America, Central America, and so on and so forth. But I don't see much engagement in the administration with Africa. No one is really involved, and I mean, it's only 2.5 months in the new administration, but I don't have any hope that there is a great deal of, except of trying to contain terrorism. They are doing it in Somalia. There is a U.S. contingent there in Somalia trying to fight Al-Shabaab, but I can see a great deal of...
Thank you. Jan, you want to... No, sorry. You want to reply on that? How do you see the engagement of what can we expect from the U.S. there?
Well, I have to say, like, the impact of USAID is really significant. I was the month basically in Juba when the USAID decision was taken. And I guess it's not just like the direct impact, it's just like the general impact on the economy, like all the suppliers, the drivers, the hospitality, all these, the impact on the economies will be significant. Especially when you come, like South Sudan, as an example, I think the withdrawal of USAID will have multifold the impacts that the pipeline thing had. It will be much, much stronger.
Explain the pipeline thing.
What had been mentioned before, that the pipeline was kind of, that the oil imports were not really coming. I have to say I disagree here anyway a bit, because the pipeline, the oil has been sold anyhow by South Sudan until 2027, so there was actually no direct impact of the pipeline thing, of the pipeline breakdown. The problem is, and this is where the second element comes in, what happened in South Sudan with the problem of the pipeline was actually it exaggerated, or like aggravated rather, the impact of the ending of international loans. Because they were looking for loans, so they had like IMF loans coming in, they had some UAE loans coming in, so they were running around the region getting new loans in, and what they got as an answer was like, okay, you can't even get your pipeline going, so how you will ever pay back these loans, so we're not giving you one. And this was the indirect effect, where it just where the economy escalated. But here now the US come in because there's two more things to consider. First, what is the impact of the US policies on the international banks, the international finance institutions, especially IMF, who is existential for quite a lot of countries in their refinancing, totally substantial. And the second element, which is more than on the peacekeeping level, the US are strong in their voluntary contributions to peacekeeping missions, which is in the region quite a few. There will be a fifth committee meeting about, which is also like the General Assembly of the fifth committee, and this fifth committee basically decides then on the financing on international peacekeeping. What if the US decide, okay, we're not paying anything anymore there? This will be basically then jeopardize most of the missions in the region, which then has again like significant impact on the general kind of stability.
Okay, I want to give the floor to Kholood, please. So how do you feel, or from your perspective in the region, so how do you see the impact on the breakdown of the USAID? And how do you see, how could it eventually filled by others?
Right. So, I mean, to answer your second question first, I don't think there are many actors that can step in the same way. I think we can see that some actors will fill some gaps, but the USAID cut is effectively not just impacting, countries on a country-by-country sort of scale. It's impacting the entire third sector. It's impacting the entire humanitarian and development industry. And this means that we will see from... Of course. It means we will see from the United Nations to international NGOs, to the health and education sectors at the national level, to local level, initiatives ranging from water, sanitation, all the way up to democratization and civic education. All of these will be impacted in some way, shape, or form. And so to have, there's no singular actor that can fill in where USAID has left. And even though we're seeing some funding come back and be restarted, for a country like Sudan, which is the world's largest humanitarian crisis, the world's largest displacement crisis, the world's largest hunger crisis, and the world's largest protection crisis, all wrapped up into one. Any cut to the money that's going in, which was already too little, will be significant. And then if you look at countries further across the region where USAID was helping to prop up entire sort of social services, that will have an impact there too. This is a very volatile region where oftentimes livelihoods come at the, the business end of a gun. And if there are very few ways to make a living, particularly in countries like South Sudan, and I totally agree with Jan, the oil pipeline issue affected the regime in South Sudan and the elites that profited from it. It did not affect ordinary people in the same way. In fact, ordinary people were saying, we don't care about the oil and we've never seen a red cent from it anyway. But USAID used to effectively provide a lot of middle-class jobs, people who used to work for the NGOs, for the UN, etc. And those people will now not be able to make ends meet. So how does South Sudan, a country where it's already undergoing sort of state collapse and has been for over a decade, how does that country fill the gap in terms of those middle-class jobs? And the answer is it can't. Even if, let's say, China were to come in and say they wanted to invest in the education sector, I doubt they'll be able to do enough as quickly. And of course, it's much easier to destroy something than it is to build it up. And so I think we're going to be seeing that in real time. But this militarization issue is key because livelihoods, agriculture, all of these things are tied together. We see a huge famine in Sudan, a famine that is now also affecting South Sudan immediately. 60% of South Sudan's sorghum and millet come from Sudan. And because we have seen much fewer harvests in Sudan, we have seen also a reciprocal and immediate impact on the food supply in South Sudan. And we're going to see also similar conditions and continuing, I should say, conditions of famine and food insecurity in places like Tigray, etc., especially if there's a war between Ethiopia and Eritrea. So you can see here that, these borders, which are in many ways artificial anyway, are very, very porous, and that means that a problem in one part of the Horn, the Greater Horn, the IGAD countries, will immediately affect others. We may not see the impact until much later, but there is an immediate impact felt, particularly by communities, particularly those on the border regions. And there's no player right now in the West or elsewhere that is able to, I think, play the role. Not just of USAID, but of the United States and sort of Pax Americana that it had in place. There's no single entity that can play that, at least not quickly.
Thank you very much. So I want to stop here with the panel and then give the open the questions to the floor. Just to summarize, so we have a series of conflicts in Ethiopia, between Ethiopia and Eritrea, between Ethiopia and Somalia for the port, for the access for the sea access and for this quest for sea access. Then we have Sudan, which is a huge conflict, and we have South Sudan, the spill over, let's see, to South Sudan. And we have very kind of a fading away or a fading withdrawal of the US with a huge impact of the crash down of the US aid, as you just very well explained. And at the same time, the EU trying to step in, but not being able to fulfill that gap, and of a series of other players, like in particular the United Emirates, which are a player that we are not used to look at as a geopolitical player. But they are financing, they are providing arms to belligerent parties, and a lot of different countries and parties are linked to the United Arab Emirates. So in particular, the Rapid Support Forces, of course, but also belligerents in South Sudan. So they own a lot of port facilities. So I think it's a very important player. Then we have also Turkey, which is a player that we do not look very often, but which is very present also in Somalia, and then of course also Russia and China. So the usual subject, and at the same time a US in withdrawal. So I want to open now the questions to the floor, please.